The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Juliana Susla, and on behalf of ISQua, I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar with Martin Fletcher on regulating health practitioners, common challenges across health systems. We are absolutely delighted to have Martin Fletcher along with us today to deliver this very interesting and insightful presentation. And before we start, I would like to say a few words about Martin by way of introduction. Martin Fletcher is currently Chief Executive Officer of Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency. With more than 15 years' experience in patient safety in Australia, the United Kingdom and internationally, he brings strong expertise in public protection and quality improvement that he would like to share with us today. Martin will take us through different approaches of regulating health practitioners and common challenges in the health systems. Just to let you know that Martin's presentation will last approximately 45 minutes and we will leave 10-15 minutes for any questions that you may have. Please type your questions in the question box and we'll do our best to get them all answered at the end of the presentation. I hope you all enjoy the webinar, and I'll just make Martin the presenter now, and over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Juliana, and sorry, I'm just going to get I've just lost the presentation. Hang on. So I can't see the presentation now, Juliana.
Well, if you just open your PowerPoint presentation, Martin, because we can see Opening Commons MBA conference on your screen at the moment.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I just need to.
So just take your time and open your PowerPoint presentation.
Okay.
Yeah, that's perfect.
You can see that now?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Juliana, and hello to everybody. Greetings from Melbourne, Australia, where it's 9 o'clock at night, so it's probably all different times to different people that I'm talking to in different places around the world. But I'm very pleased to be able to speak with you tonight, and I look forward to your questions and comments on my presentation. As Juliana said, what I'd really like to do is talk a little bit about what I see as some of the major global trends in relation to the regulation of health practitioners across the world, because although there are obvious differences across health systems in the way that we are organised, are actually, I think, quite an important set of core common challenges in this world of regulation. So I'd like to give you my view of those trends. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Australian experience, because over the past few years there's actually been a major change in the way that we regulate health practitioners here in Australia. So I'd like to tell you a little bit briefly about that experience. And then I'd like to just end with a discussion about what I think are some of the common challenges that regulatory systems face across the world, and again just say a little bit about how these are emerging as issues for the work we do here in Australia. Just to really set the context for what I mean when I'm talking about the regulation of health practitioners. So I'm talking here really about licensing or registration of health professionals, usually on a statutory basis, so from a legislative base. What the characteristics of regulation of practitioners would usually see some sort of enforceable requirements for entry into the particular profession. So there are certain requirements that must be met in order to be able to call yourself a certain sort of profession. There are the requirements around education, which are essentially the pathway to registration in terms of the educational experience and qualifications that people need to have. There are standards of practice, and then there's the ability to regulate conduct, and in some contexts performance and health, and if needed, the ability to be able to restrict the registration of a practitioner in some form to protect the public. And I think one of the things that's very important in terms of regulatory systems around the world is that we typically talk about these systems as being a protective rather than punitive, so that their focus is really about what's needed to make sure patient and public safety is protected, rather than an orientation towards in some way punishing the practitioner. But there's quite an interesting debate that emerges around what that balance looks like. So if I turn, I think, firstly to this issue of what are some of the global trends in the regulation of health practitioners. Well, I think the first thing to say is that it's actually a time of great change. And when you look around the world, there are many different approaches being developed and many changes being implemented to regulation. And I would say there isn't necessarily any single model that would be seen as, the best or right model for everybody. But certainly, as I say, lots of different models and approaches emerging. I think we're seeing increasingly that a recognition that the core focus of regulation must be on patient and public safety. So in other words, regulation is not there to serve the interests of the profession that is being regulated, but is really there to serve the interests of the community in terms of the protection of patient and public safety. There's a lot of interest in the design of effective regulatory systems, and this really goes to questions about how do you get the right, a proportionate regulatory system that doesn't impose an unreasonable burden on those who are being regulated, on health practitioners. And increasingly, I think there is interest in the costs of regulation and where are the opportunities for greater economies of scale in how we regulate health practitioners, and some very interesting work that's particularly been done in the UK around looking at some of these questions of cost and economy of scale across professions. I think we see a trend globally towards what you might call professionally led rather than self-regulation. So I think models of regulation in the past have tended to be about a group of practitioners from that profession sitting in a sense in a peer judgment on their peers. And while I think there is a continued element of that in many approaches to practitioner regulation around the world, what we are also seeing is much greater community involvement in regulatory systems. So, for example, in the system that we have here in Australia, we have both community members and practitioner members who are part of all of the decision making in relation to regulatory decisions that are made about individual health practitioners. So again, I think that's very much an international trend. If I continue on the global trends, we see a much greater range of stakeholder involvement. So I think a recognition that insofar as regulation is here to serve the public, that there are a range of stakeholders who have an interest in how regulation works. I think an interesting trend towards greater transparency. So very much I think a focus on where does the public interest lie in terms of the right to know, if you like, about practitioners, balanced with what's the appropriate focus on the privacy and confidentiality of those practitioners. But on the whole, I think a move towards much greater transparency. I think a growing interest in multi-profession approaches. Rather than necessarily emphasising what the points of difference might be in relation to standards and requirements across professions, what in fact are the points of commonality and the areas of common interest. And so I think there's a huge interest in multi-profession approaches, and I think the beginnings of some interest about whether in fact regulation could not only be focused on health but also go into social care as well, so the integration of both health and social care. A greater focus on ongoing competence to practice. So time was that people would have graduated from a qualification and received a qualification and become registered, and they would have been registered for life with no expectation that they needed to be able to demonstrate any ongoing competence to practice. When we look internationally at trends in regulation, we see that there's a focus on how do we assure the ongoing competence to practice of a practitioner, not just what they do when they first enter the profession. And then I think all regulatory systems face the challenge of the global mobility of the health workforce. So For example, here in Australia, we have a huge number of overseas trained doctors who work in Australia, and there's huge global mobility of that workforce, as there is of the nursing and midwifery workforce as well. So the challenge of global mobility and the appropriate regulatory response to that is something that all regulatory systems cope with. So I think, as I say, a set of common challenges, notwithstanding there are differences in the way that different regulatory systems are organised across the world. I mentioned before the concept of the interest in well-designed regulation and regulation burden, and I thought people might be interested also in some work that's come out of the Professional Standards Authority in the UK and the work of Harry Caton and his team around really this sort of concept of right touch regulation. So not light touch regulation, but right touch regulation. And as you can see illustrated here, in a sense, what are some of the key design elements that you might think about in designing the right and proportionate balance of regulation, which go to issues like making sure you're clear on the problem before the solution, because of course not all issues that have to do with the conduct and performance and competence of health practitioners necessarily require a regulatory response. There may well be, for example, things that can be done at an employment level, being clear on the risks, being as close to the problem as possible that you're trying to solve, focusing on the outcome you're trying to achieve. As I said, not necessarily seeing regulation as the answer to everything, keeping it as simple as you can, checking for the unintended consequences, and having a continuous process of reviewing and responding to change. So I think a very important concept in the area of regulatory design is this concept of right touch regulation. So let me just tell you a little bit about the system here in Australia. So here's a map of Australia for those of you who haven't been here or don't know what it looks like. So we're a country of about 23 million people. We have a federal system of government, so we have a national government, and we have governments in each of our states and territories, each of which have distinctive responsibilities. We spend about 9.3% of our GDP on health, so that puts us sort of somewhere in the middle of spending on health. We have a big private sector, although an overall 70% public funded health service. We enjoy good health status overall, although there's a major gap in relation to the health status of our Indigenous population, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. We have a particular issue around the maldistribution of the health workforce. So if you look at that map, which I think is the size of Europe as a landmass, when you start to get into some of the rural and remote areas in Queensland, Western Australia and Northern Territory, there are significant shortages of health workforce, although there are, and then in other areas such as some of the major cities, there are oversupply of workforce, so this maldistribution is an issue. And as I said earlier, we rely quite significantly on an international workforce, particularly in terms of medicine and particularly in terms of addressing this maldistribution. So for example, there are pathways to registration in Australia that if you're willing to work in a rural and remote area, there is a different pathway to then if you are not willing to do that. So again, the international workforce is very important for us. There's a very long and proud history of regulation in Australia. If we go back in the history books, doctors were registered way back in 1837 in Tasmania, which is the small island at the south of Australia. And that in fact predates the General Medical Council in the UK by 21 years. Regulation is a state and territory responsibility, not a Commonwealth responsibility. There's been a lot of change over the years, but it's been pretty piecemeal. But as I said earlier, we've had a pretty major transformation of regulation here in Australia in the past 4 years. The other point I'd make about regulation, and I think this goes to the point I made earlier, about the level of stakeholder interest there, is that regulation is something that attracts a lot of public debate. So here's a sort of set of recent media clippings from Australia, and what you see are issues around scope of practice, so what it is that we allow practitioners to do or not do, and then issues around what different practitioners in the health team are able to do. A lot around how we deal with problems. So this goes to the question I said earlier about what's the right, in a protective jurisdiction. A view, I think, at times that we should be tougher in terms of how we deal with these things, and a lot of debate about what the right balance is of how practitioners are sanctioned. So I think this is really a feature of many systems, that there is rightly, I think, a lot of interest and public debate about the work of regulation, and as I say, that goes to the fact that ultimately regulation is there to serve the public interest. I guess, again, like many health systems around the world, here in Australia we've had a number of drivers for reform. So we've certainly had our own share, if you like, of high-profile major failures in terms of patient safety, and this the book that says Hedley Thomas relates to a particular circumstance in Queensland. We've had this interesting situation where because practitioners had to be regulated in each state and territory, that meant that they, if you wanted to move around the country to work as a health practitioner, you had to get registered in another state or territory. And of course, when we came to some of the big natural disasters like bushfires, that quite literally was a barrier to health teams being able to move into areas of need easily because they weren't registered in a particular state or territory. And then we've looked at health workforce more widely and really looked at, well, what are some of the enablers of making sure that Australia has the health workforce it needs into the 21st century. So patient safety, workforce mobility, workforce needs really as drivers for reform in regulation. So this is the change that we've gone through over the past 3.5 years. So we've moved from 8 state and territory based arrangements to 1 national scheme. We had more than 95 health profession boards across the country, and we now only have 14. We had 75 acts of parliament, and we now largely have nationally consistent legislation across the country. We had 38 regulatory organisations. We now have 1 national organisation, which is ISQua, which is the organisation I lead. And we had lots of data about health practitioners all around the place, and we now have a single set of national online registers that are accessible through our website. So there's a bit of an image in the background of that slide of the moon, and I think that reflects the fact that we thought that this was a change that was probably so big it could have been seen from the moon. So here in Australia, these are the professions that we regulate. There are 14 groups of professions, and they're all part of this national scheme. And there are now over 600,000 health practitioners regulated through the national scheme in Australia. That equates to about 1 in 20 working Australians. So again, I think it goes to the size and importance of the health sector in many countries when you look at the size of the regulated health workforce. This just shows you a bit of data about the fact that we've got an overall growth in the number of registered health practitioners, and just gives you the breakdown by profession. I wanted to just comment a bit on our legislation because this raises some interesting issues for regulation as well. So as you can see, these are the objectives of the legislation that we work within. As you can see, at the top of the list is this focus on public protection as our core responsibility. But I think what you can also see when you look at the objectives is a set of objectives that relate to the flexibility, responsiveness and sustainability of our health workforce, and the ability to enable innovation, and also a requirement to facilitate access to services in accordance with the public interest. So I think in our legislation there's an interesting mix of a set of objectives that relate to protection and a set of objectives that relate to workforce. That's quite an unusual mix when you look around the world. Most regulators don't have a workforce set of objectives, and of course some of the most difficult decisions for a regulatory agency are the balance of, well, what's the right thing you need to do to protect the public with, what is the, responsibility to make sure people actually have access to services and that the health workforce is developing in a way that's right for the future. So here's what we do. We work with 14 boards to set professional standards, which, as I said earlier, are the requirements for entry into the profession. We register practitioners on an annual basis, and they're required to comply with the standards to be registered. We maintain a national register, and I'll show that to you in a minute. We manage notifications, which are essentially what we call complaints about what might be considered fitness to practice issues around competence, performance and health. And we set the standards for the educational pathways to registration, which in our system are called accreditation, and they are typically the pathways that lead to registration. These are the registration standards that we have. So we have 5 common domains. We have a standard in relation to criminal history, a set of requirements around English language skills and competence, a set of requirements around professional indemnity insurance arrangements, a set of requirements around continuing professional development, and that goes to the point I made earlier about how people might demonstrate ongoing competence, and a set of requirements around recency of practice, which essentially are around being able to demonstrate recency of practice to stay and registered or to return to registration after an absence. Some of these standards are different across professions. Some of them are common. So, for example, our standard in relation to criminal history and English language is pretty much common across all of the different professions in the scheme. And all of these are available on our website if you're interested. Just to give you an example of the criminal history checks. So this was just some data around the checks. So we in this year, which was 12-13, we did 52,000 checks. 6% of those identified a criminal history. Of those, a much smaller number, 450, had a potential to affect registration, and of those 450, 40 in fact resulted in some sort of action on registration. So I think just to give you an example of how a standard translates into an action, and then how that translates ultimately into some sort of restriction on a practitioner's registration. And I guess the point to make here is that the vast majority of professionals who are registered uphold the standards very well. It's really only a very small number where we may need to take action. I said earlier that we have an online register, so one of the most important things that a regulation agency does is to maintain a register of those practitioners who are registered. We have an online register, so you can search every single one of those 600,000 health practitioners, and you can find out about their registration status. You can find out if there are any restrictions on their practice. You can find out information about their qualifications, how long they've been registered and the like. So I think a very important information asset. I think one of the challenges we face is that although this is really designed for the community, our sense is that community awareness and understanding of registration and how consumers and patients might use registration information in decisions they make about their healthcare is still pretty limited, and that there's a lot more I think we can and should be doing to raise awareness of registration and why it's important information and how the community can use this as an information asset. We also maintain a list of cancelled health practitioners. So this is an example that I just printed from our website, so that if a practitioner has had their registration cancelled, and this would typically be because of a serious breach of professional standards or misconduct, we publish in an identifiable form the information about that, and this gives you an example of a medical practitioner whose registration was cancelled, and this again is also searchable on our website as well. So again, it's serving a public interest in terms of patients knowing this and the community knowing this, and looking for good transparency in terms of this information being available to the community. Okay, I want to now just finally turn to what I think are some of the challenges and issues for regulatory systems across the world and sort of particularly issues that we're facing here in Australia. And I guess I wanted to partly pick up on this question, first of all, of the link between regulation and patient safety, and really this question of how should we regulate, what you might call honest error. I wanted to touch upon this issue of ensuring ongoing competence. I want to say a little bit about social media and then just make a couple of comments about community transparency and community trust. So if I go first of all to the question of error and patient safety, we all, I think, know that many of us who work in the health system and use health services have a shared responsibility for patient safety. So here I've tried to illustrate in this diagram, the role that practitioners, employers, educators, the law, the community indemnity organisations and indeed regulators play in relation to patient safety. And every player has a role in making sure that care is as safe as it can be. But I think one of the challenges we face in the world of patient safety, indeed in the world of the regulation, is what is the right balance of the focus on the individual versus the focus on the system, because we know that many of the reasons, we know that many of the errors and mistakes that occur in the healthcare system, what the practitioner has done is at the sharp end, and when we look more closely at that through root cause analysis and the like, we often find there are a whole lot of contributing factors in the system that in a sense have almost set that up as an accident waiting to happen. So I think it's a real challenge for regulatory systems where what we often see is the individual at the sharp end about what the right regulatory response is to that, recognising this wider system context for patient safety. And I think this whole area of how we better link what we do in practitioner regulation with the wider system effort around patient safety is an area for continued focus and work. Many of us would know about the examples from the UK, and Mid Staffordshire has been an example that's had a huge amount of attention and profile. I worked in the UK for a number of years in patient safety. I think one of the issues this highlights is the whole role of clinical governance in the system, and again, what do we expect around clinical governance systems in terms of supporting health practitioners to make sure they deliver safe, competent care, and how should regulatory systems respond where there may have been weaknesses in terms of how practitioners have carried out their clinical governance responsibilities. So I think a very important set of issues there as well. One of the things that we've done here in Australia, and again this is a feature in a number of regulatory systems around the world, is that we've tried to set out in our legislation a set of circumstances where it is a mandatory requirement for a practitioner or an employer to tell us about something that a practitioner has done. And this slide just summarises that essentially, if you as a healthcare practitioner know of another healthcare practitioner, or you as an employer health practitioner who's practising while they're intoxicated, who engages in some sort of sexual misconduct in their professional practice, who has a significant physical or mental impairment affecting their practice, or who is practising in a way that's a significant departure from accepted professional standards, you must tell us as the regulator. And indeed, if you don't tell us, that in itself could be a problem for you. And I think this has been quite a controversial area about whether it's a good thing to have mandatory notifications or not. But I think it really goes to this issue that, as we know, when we look back often on things that have gone wrong in healthcare systems, or individuals who have been delivering unsafe or poor quality care, what you often find is that people say, oh, look, we've known about that for years, we just don't refer to him anymore, or we've found a way of working around that to make sure that it doesn't cause a problem. So in a sense, I think mandatory notifications are all about trying to sidestep any sense that there's a voluntary, a discretionary requirement around reporting, and really making very clear the circumstances in which a mandatory notification should occur. So I think this whole sort of issue of what is the right place of voluntary reporting, what is the right place of mandatory reporting is a very important issue for many regulatory systems. And as I say, in our own circumstance, we've set out these as the requirements for when you must tell us about a practitioner. If I just move very quickly or next to the issue of ongoing competence. So I said before that time was, you registered when you graduated and that was it for life. And there's been a lot of interest, and again, this is work drawn from the UK, in what you need to do to make sure that you have some assurance that a practitioner continues to be safe and competent to practice throughout their professional career. And the example here really is that if, a few years ago in the UK, if you were a pilot, in aviation, a commercial pilot, that in your career you could expect to probably have your skills and competence very carefully checked 30 to 40 times in your career. If you were a senior doctor, it would have been a 0. Is that right? And of course, as we know, healthcare has been very interested to learn from the experience of aviation, particularly in the world of safety. So in the UK, there is now a system of what's called revalidation that's being rolled out for medical practitioners, being led by the General Medical Council. This system really sets out a system for requiring that medical practitioners undergo regular performance appraisal, that there's feedback on performance, that there's feedback from patients, and that on a regular cycle, usually of 5 years, there's some sort of closing the loop with the regulatory agency. So the UK experience in revalidation is probably the most comprehensive approach at the moment, and it's still early days. But as I said earlier, there's a lot of interest in all regulatory systems about what's the right approach to ensuring competence. Typically, and indeed here what we do in Australia is you set requirements around education, but is that enough, and is there more that we should be doing? And I think the other interesting issue is, are there particular groups that that should be targeted more closely? So again, if I use an example from Australia, if you have a driver's licence in Australia, I think once you hit 80, you actually have to go and get tested annually, because there's a recognition that as you get older, some of your skills and awareness may not be as good as when you were younger. Should we be thinking about revalidation for health practitioners in relation to certain age cohorts, for example, or in relation to certain risk profiles? So I think this area of revalidation is very important. I think, there's a number of lessons emerging already. As I said, the continuing competence is a focus for all regulatory systems. I think there's a debate and much more evidence to gather about the different methods and approaches. I think there's probably also a recognition of the importance of local systems for identifying and managing poor performance. So in some ways, if you wait to get to the regulator, that probably means that, quite a lot of stuff has not necessarily been acted on earlier in the piece. So what is the role of employers and others in identifying and managing poor performance early? Because obviously the better it can be identified and addressed, the earlier it can be identified and addressed, the better. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity to learn from the UK experience with revalidation, and I think probably more work to be done on what the ultimate evidence is for how you might focus on continuing competence and how that actually links ultimately to safer outcomes, an area where I think is ripe for some greater research. Social media, as the third issue I wanted to touch upon, this is a very interesting area for regulators. On the screen here you can see a screenshot of the fact that we are actually very recently now active on Twitter. So I think there's a question of how regulators use social media such as Twitter, Facebook, and all those other things that are too numerous to name as a regulator. But I think there's also a set of challenges around what is the appropriate regulatory response to how health practitioners use social media as well. And I think this is a really emerging, challenging area for regulation because there's so much change and dynamic movement in the world of social media. As I say, we've just had our first foray into social media with Twitter, and we'll be doing more in that space. But I think it's a challenging, but I think very important opportunity for regulation. The other image here is from the Healthcare Professions Council in the UK, and this is sort of the concept of the app that you might have that that if you're a consumer of healthcare that you have on your phone and you perhaps go and receive healthcare and you're not happy with what's happened, here's your app that would allow you to log your concern and for that to be followed up. So again, how do we harness social media in a way that actually is going to be helpful in terms of the role of regulation? Finally, I wanted to make a point about transparency and trust. We've had some very interesting and vigorous media debate here in Australia about what is in the public interest in terms of what we publish about health practitioners. And this was an article that was published that was pretty critical of us, actually, basically saying that we weren't doing enough to put in our register information about the disciplinary record of health practitioners. And as I say, I think this goes to this whole debate about where the public interest lies. So on the one hand, at one end of the continuum, you could say there's an absolute public right to know that if a health practitioner is the subject of a complaint or has ever had any restriction on their practice throughout their career, that the public have an absolute right to know that. On the other hand, I think what are the privacy and confidentiality rights of the practitioners involved? So if you're a practitioner who's had restrictions on your registration, you've addressed whatever the issues are, and then there's no longer a concern about your practice, is it fair that somebody knows that that might have been something in your past that is no longer relevant to your practice now? So, there isn't a right or wrong answer, but I think there's a very tricky balance to get right here. And as I say, we've had a fair amount of criticism in Australia about the fact that there's a view that we should be doing more to actually make it easier for the public and consumers to access this information. And this was an editorial from the Medical Journal of Australia that picked up on that issue about 12 months ago. My own view is that there is, I think, more we should be doing around transparency. I think, again, as I said, this is a challenge for all regulatory systems around the world, but I think the default should be towards greater openness rather than greater secrecy. But I think we do need to carefully understand and balance not only the public's rights in this, but also the rights of practitioners, and be very clear on where we think the public interest ultimately lies. I talked earlier about how we get lots of media debate about these issues. Finally, I just wanted to close with perhaps a sort of reflection from Confucius, really, and I think this, to me, goes to the question of public trust and confidence. That ultimately, I think what Confucius says is that if you had weapons, if you're a ruler and you have weapons and you have food and you have trust, the last thing you should give up is trust, because without trust you're nothing. And I think this is a really important challenge for regulatory systems around the world, that because we are here to serve the community, because we are here to serve the public interest and ultimately to take steps to make sure, to the best of our ability, that the public and patients are safe, it's incredibly important that the public have confidence and trust in what we do. And I think some of what I've touched upon tonight in terms of understanding of regulation, the protective nature of it rather than the punitive nature of it, the importance of transparency and openness, all go to these questions of public trust and confidence. I think you can have the best, technically the best legislation and technically the best system, but if you don't have trust and confidence, then it all is all pretty hollow, really. So I think just I think Confucius has a lot to offer, I think, in terms of, ultimately what is important in terms of how we regulate health practitioners. So I'll stop there. That's our website, and a lot of the material I've talked about, the standards and a whole range of other material is on our website if you'd like to explore any of this information further. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for this great presentation, and we already have a couple of questions. Sorry, just a bit of echo here. Hold on one second. And the first one is from Astari Angarani, and she is asking for you to describe the way of revalidation of healthcare practitioners in Australia. Is it happening in the form of evaluation or some other sort of certification?
So in Australia, we don't currently have a system
Martin?
of revalidation. Yeah, can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
In Australia, we don't currently have a system of revalidation in the same form as is in the UK. What we require is that people demonstrate, show us evidence of their continuing professional development. So we typically set requirements that are different across different professions in relation, it might be in relation to hours of professional development they have to do on an annual basis in order to be registered, or types of professional development. And so really what we're effectively doing is saying that professional development is a proxy for evidence that somebody is keeping up to date with their knowledge, but we don't really test skills and competence in any systematic way. The other thing we do is that we do have a requirement around recency of practice. So, for example, if you're somebody who leaves your registration for a while, if you're going to return to registration, you need to be able to demonstrate that you've got recency of practice, and if you don't, there may be additional requirements we put in relation to, bridging courses or additional supervision, for example, to make sure that you're safe to practice.
Perfect, thank you. The next question would be from Peter Carter. He's here with us today, and he would like to ask his own question.
Hello, Martin. How are you?
Good, thanks, Peter. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. It was great. There are issues around the world, and not least of all in Europe, around cross-border healthcare, both issues for patients and issues for professionals. I wonder whether you would comment on that in relation to regulation, and also related to that, and it's an issue in Australia as well as other places in the world, is the question of medical tourism. Could you comment on those two issues?
Sure. So I think in part this goes to the issue I highlighted at the beginning about the sort of common challenge of the global mobility of the health workforce. And I think, clearly in Europe, as you're alluding to, Peter, I think there's been some very interesting issues emerge around global mobility in the European context, really, and I know I see from some of the recent UK media, for example, that there are actually plans to tighten up on things like the ability for regulators to more stringently test English language skills and competence, because there's been limitations on being able to do that given the mobility requirements of the European community. So I think this, as I think this continues to be a really important challenge. As I say, we've got, in a sense, we've got a set of issues around, more and more people want to work in different countries, and how do we appropriately facilitate that sort of mobility, but also I think acknowledge and recognise, equivalence in terms of qualifications and experience. And then I think in countries like Australia and others, we've got particular workforce needs, and how do we appropriately facilitate and maintain standards of safety and quality around the movement of the health workforce. In terms of medical tourism, that's an interesting one. I think it's not an area I've given a lot of thought to. I think the issue I think we've probably seen more is what happens when, you know, with the growth of technology, when you're starting to see you may have actually some sort of elements of services delivered offshore. You know, so you might have, you know, radiology results being interpreted offshore, and then where does the regulatory responsibility sit if there is a, you know, if there is an issue in relation to how that's been done. So I think there's some quite interesting challenges around that as well. There's quite well-developed mechanisms for cooperation among regulators, particularly in medicine, probably nursing as well. And there is quite a lot of information sharing across regulators as well. And we're actually at the moment in some early discussions with WHO, for example, about some work we might do here in the Western Pacific about strengthening regional collaboration in a number of these areas, given, you know, given some of these trends that we're talking about.
Thank you, Martin. That's great.
Thank you, Martin. That was very interesting. The next question would be from Roshan Boland, and she thanks you. She thanks for the very interesting presentation, and she asks, what are your thoughts on regulation of healthcare administrators, such as CEOs of hospitals?
Oh, okay. Well, I'd probably go back to my slide on right touch regulation, and you know, I want to be asking a set of questions around what the problem is that we think we need to solve here, and is regulation the right approach? Because my sense is that there may be a number of other ways that you may want to address concerns about, you know, competence and performance and those sort of issues in relation to CEOs and managers that may not actually require the sort of registration and regulatory approach that I've talked about here. So, for example, there could be codes of practice. There could be, you know, you know, employer-based sort of performance appraisal schemes and the like. So, my sense would be, I'd be very cautious about, you know, applying the sort of model of health practitioner regulations, such as I've described here, to sort of some of those wider areas of health management, and, you know, let's say be clear on the problem or issue that we think needs to be addressed and what the range of different approaches might be to actually solve that problem.
Perfect, thank you. The next question would be from Nitita, and she is from WHO. She asks, if health practitioners registration is cancelled, can they reapply? And under what condition can they be granted a renewal?
It depends. So typically, well, if I use the Australian experience, typically a registration would be cancelled by a tribunal, so a quasi-legal body, and depending on the circumstances, they might cancel a registration and say, you can't.
Martin, we can't hear you. Martin, we can't hear you. I think we might have lost Martin.
Who's the voice there?
Can you still hear me?
Hello, can anybody hear me?
Yeah, I can. There's a
Okay.
funny noise there, but I can hear you.
Martin, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
I think we lost you for a bit, so I think for maybe the last 10-20 seconds we couldn't hear you at all.
Oh, okay. Where did you lose me?
I think maybe the first, when you start answering the question, and probably with the first few words, so I think it would be better if you try again.
Okay. So can you hear me now? That's okay?
Yes.
We can hear you now. Perfect.
Okay. So I'm getting a strange noise.
Martin, I'm very sorry. It seems that there is an echo here. So if you can hear me, you can go ahead with answering the question. We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. It was a question from Natita about how long people are cancelled for and whether they can reapply. If I just draw on the Australian experience, what I was saying was that typically a registration would be cancelled by a tribunal, which is a quasi-legal body, and they would usually specify the length of time for the cancellation according to the seriousness of the matter that had led to the cancellation. So it might be 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, where there would be a restriction on a person before they could reapply. In some circumstances, people might actually enter into undertakings not to reapply at all, so that as I say, would come down to the individual circumstance of the matter.
Perfect, thank you. The next question would be from Patricia McKernan, and she's asking whether there are any regulatory standards for clinical governance.
We don't have regulatory standards for clinical governance, but I think there's been work done in this area in the UK. I'd probably look more to the UK for that. I mean, we have a code of practice and we have guidelines that talk about, you know, what the expectations of good healthcare practice are in each of the different professions, but it doesn't really specifically go into regulatory standards for individuals in clinical governance. I mean, there are obviously regulatory standards around accreditation and the like, more widely accreditation systems for clinical governance systems, but I'm not aware of sort of standards for individuals around clinical governance. But as I say, there may be some work in the UK that could be looked at.
Thank you, Martin. The next question would be from Moza Alishak. She's only new to fellowship program. She's only signed up recently, but she has a question for you as well. She's asking, how can we practice transparency?
Well, as I say, I think in the world of regulation, there's a number of things we can do. I think first of all, we've got to do more to help the community understand what regulation is and how it works and why it's important. And the point I was making earlier about, people even understanding what a registered health practitioner is, what it means to be registered, what does it mean if somebody's got conditions or limitations on their register. I think the second thing we need to do is if somebody does have a concern about their health care and has raised a complaint or a sort of issue about the fitness to practice of a practitioner, I think we need to give people really clear information about what we do and how we assess that risk and what we don't do as well, so that people have a very clear understanding of the process and hopefully have an understanding of, that their expectations can be understood and addressed in terms of the process and the outcome, or if not, they can be provided advice on other options. And then thirdly, I think, is this issue I flagged about what information we publish about practitioners, particularly if there has been some sort of adverse finding about a practitioner. So it might have been, for example, that there are requirements for supervision or requirements for additional education on their, that are on their practice. Making sure that there is appropriate public disclosure of that, but in a way that isn't, isn't unfair and punitive of the practitioner involved, and that's the balance that I think is sometimes quite hard to strike.
Perfect, thank you. The next question would be, we have a lot of questions today, and the next one is from Saiful, and he wonders, how does the accreditation link to regulation?
Probably partly depends on what you mean by accreditation. So accreditation for us means two things. So accreditation in our system means the standards for the educational programs that you do, which are the pathway to registration. So we accredit educational programs and providers, and we say to students that that's an approved program of study, and if you do that program and you successfully graduate, you're eligible to register. And it's approved because we know there are certain standards that are being met in the delivery of that program. The other use of accreditation, though, is really about the sort of processes around standards and systems for assessing healthcare organisations, typically in terms of the quality and safety of what they do. And at the moment, I'd say, in terms of organisational accreditation and practitioner regulation, they're pretty separate sort of systems. I would expect that accreditation would probably set requirements on organisations around making sure they have systems and processes in place, you know, to make sure that their health, you know, staff that they employed are appropriately registered, and they have appropriate systems for notifying, you know, the regulator if there is a set of concerns that need to be notified. But I think on the whole, they operate, certainly in the Australian context, quite separately. So it would be interesting if there were any examples of where there was a closer relationship.
Thank you, Martin. Nikita is coming back with another question for you, and she's asking now, how are the practitioners associated with adverse event?
Well, this partly goes back to what I was saying before about the link between
Martin, we might have lost you again. Well, I think we should just finish this webinar. We have some technical difficulties here, and we have lost Martin at this stage again. So I would like to remind everybody that the recording of this webinar will be available on ISQua website within 24 hours. So please pass the information to anybody who you think might benefit from watching this webinar. And let me express huge thanks to Martin for his time today, and also to those who have attended. Have a great day, and I hope you enjoyed this webinar. Thank you.